The legend was older than the stones it was carved into. Across the alien world of Vescoria, countless civilizations had risen and fallen, and through them all the tale remained unchanged. Deep within the forbidden caverns, beyond the reach of time and reason, an ancient warrior queen sat upon a throne of blackened stone, 3 swords buried in her chest. No one knew her name anymore. No one dared speak of her fate. The only thing the universe agreed upon was this: if the blades were ever removed, ruin would follow. Elias Carter had never been one to believe in legends. He wasn't here for myths or whispered warnings passed between fearful Vescari elders. He was an explorer, a xenoarchaeologist, a man whose pulse quickened at the scent of forgotten history. And this world, with its shattered ruins and sunken temples, had called to him like a song meant only for those willing to listen. The Vescari had not welcomed him. They were a pale, silver-skinned people with slit-pupil eyes that watched him with something between suspicion and pity. They spoke of curses and old gods, of a tomb that must never be disturbed. But they also spoke of things Elias couldn't ignore. Energy readings that defied their own technological understanding, ruins marked by languages older than even their oldest records. It was enough to make him stay even when the warnings became threats. When he finally stood before the entrance to the cavern, deep in the heart of a jungle thick with bioluminescent vines, the air itself seemed to hum. He exhaled, his breath curling in the unnatural cold. No guards. No traps. No signs that anyone had entered for centuries. It was as if the world itself had sealed this place off, not with stone but with fear. He stepped forward. The descent was steep, the stone pathway slick with condensation. Light from his wrist-mounted torch flickered against the cavern walls, revealing murals that had been untouched for thousands of years. They depicted a woman, not a queen draped in finery, but a warrior in blood-stained armor, standing against armies that should have broken her. And there, in the final image, she sat upon a throne, impaled by 3 swords. The air grew heavy. Then he saw her. She was exactly as the carvings had foretold. At the end of the chamber, seated on an obsidian throne, was the warrior queen. Her skin was stone, cracked and weathered as if time had tried and failed to erode her. The swords were unmistakable, one through her heart, one through her stomach, one through her ribs. Each blade was different, as if crafted by hands from different ages, yet they all gleamed as if freshly forged. Elias hesitated. She wasn't dead. Not exactly. There was something unnatural about the way she sat, as if she might rise at any moment, as if she were merely waiting. The cavern was utterly silent, the kind of silence that swallows all sound before it can fully form. His fingers twitched at his side. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. Instead he took a step closer. There was no logical reason for what happened next. No science could explain it, no theory he had studied could account for it. But as his gaze settled on the smallest of the 3 swords, the one embedded just above her heart, he felt something pull at him. Not physically but something deeper. A sensation that bypassed flesh and bone, reaching into something more fundamental. His breath hitched. The sword wanted to be drawn. The thought struck him with such clarity that he almost laughed at the absurdity of it. And yet, the longer he stood there, the more certain he became. His fingers moved before his mind could catch up, reaching out, gripping the hilt. It was warm. Not the cold steel he expected, but warm as if it had been waiting for him. Somewhere in the depths of his mind he knew he was making a mistake. But Elias Carter had never been one to leave a mystery unsolved. He pulled. The moment the blade left her chest, the world breathed in. The air shifted, the cavern trembled, dust shaking loose from the ceiling in cascading waves. The queen's body cracked, not crumbling, not breaking apart, but shedding its stone layer like an exoskeleton. Beneath it, flesh. Pale, scarred, real. Then her eyes opened. Not with the sluggish confusion of something waking from sleep, but with the sharp clarity of something returning to purpose. Elias staggered back, the sword still in his grip. His heart pounded against his ribs, his mind scrambling to process what was happening, what he had done. The queen's gaze locked onto him, burning with something ancient, something unshaken by time. And then, in a voice rough with disuse yet steady as a blade, she spoke. "Who dares?" Elias did not breathe. The warrior queen stared at him, her eyes like molten gold, their glow pulsing in the dim cavern light. Her voice had been raw, edged with something ancient, something dangerous. He gripped the sword tighter, its weight suddenly too heavy in his hands. The silence between them stretched. Then slowly, impossibly she moved. Her fingers twitched first, flexing as if testing whether they were still her own. Then her shoulders rolled, muscle shifting beneath scarred skin, the remnants of petrified stone crumbling from her form. She inhaled, a sharp, deliberate act as if tasting air for the first time in centuries. Elias took a step back. She tracked the movement, eyes narrowing slightly. "Who?" she said again, her voice stronger this time, though still rough with centuries of silence. "Dares?" His mind scrambled for an answer, but his tongue refused to cooperate. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. It was the overwhelming wrongness of the situation. A moment ago she had been stone, a relic frozen in time. Now she stood before him, breathing, alive. He swallowed hard. Elias Carter. The name meant nothing to her. He could see it in the way her brow furrowed, the way her fingers flexed as though itching to grasp a weapon. The only weapons in reach, however, were the two remaining swords buried in her chest. Her gaze flicked down to them, lingering for a long, unreadable moment. Then she exhaled sharply as if exasperated and turned her attention back to him. "You pulled it," she murmured, her tone shifting from accusation to something else. Something closer to calculation. Elias nodded. He thought about telling her he hadn't meant to, that something about the sword had called to him, but the words died in his throat. He wasn't sure he wanted to admit that. She took a step forward. He took another step back. And then the ground shook. A deep, reverberating pulse surged through the cavern, a soundless shockwave that pressed against his ribs. The torches lining the walls flickered wildly, their blue flames guttering in the sudden surge of unseen energy. Dust rained from the ceiling. The air itself seemed to thrum, resonating with something vast and unrelenting. She turned her head sharply toward the cavern entrance, eyes narrowing. "They come." Elias blinked. "What?" She didn't answer him. He didn't need to. A second pulse rippled through the air, this one more tangible, carrying a distant echoing sound. A horn, deep and bone-rattling, like something blown from a war long forgotten. His stomach dropped. Something had felt what he had done. And they were coming. Elias barely had time to process the thought before the queen moved. He was fast. Too fast. One moment she was standing before her throne. The next she was inches from him, her hand clamping around his wrist. Heat surged through his skin, not physical warmth but something deeper, something older. The sword in his grip pulsed as if in response, and for the briefest moment he swore he saw something behind her eyes. Recognition. Then she released him and turned toward the entrance. "We leave." Elias hesitated. "Leave? Just like that? Where?" She didn't turn to face him, but her shoulders squared, a rigid strength settling into her frame. "Away from this tomb. Away from them. Whoever they were." His pulse quickened. "And if I say no?" Now she did look at him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were not. "You will not." And somehow, impossibly, Elias knew she was right. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered any lingering doubts. They were fast, many, their movements precise and coordinated. Not the stumbling chaos of explorers or treasure seekers. These were soldiers. And judging by the flickering blue glow that now lined the cavern walls, they weren't just Vescari. Elias clenched his jaw. Whatever was coming, it had been waiting. The queen turned fully toward him then, one hand lifting slightly, not as a command but an offering. "Come, Elias Carter," she said, his name rolling off her tongue like something newly tasted. "You have woken the storm. Now you must weather it." His fingers curled tighter around the sword hilt. Then he took her hand. And ran. The tunnels twisted ahead of them, ancient stone passages carved long before the Vescari even had a word for time. Elias ran, breath coming in sharp bursts, his grip firm around the sword that had started it all. Behind him, the warrior queen moved like a shadow, her pace unyielding, her presence as inescapable as the pounding of his own heart. The cavern trembled again, another pulse rippling through the walls like the world itself was trying to warn them. They were getting closer. Elias risked a glance back. His torchlight flickered across carvings lining the tunnel walls, scenes of battles long lost, warriors falling beneath the weight of something unseen. Not an army. Not a war. Something worse. "Where are we going?" he asked between breaths. The queen did not falter. "Away from the tomb." Elias gritted his teeth. "Yes, I figured that much, thanks." She shot him a brief look, sharp, assessing, almost amused if there had been time for such things. "There is a way out. A path only the awakened may take." Awakened. The word clung to the air between them. He didn't ask if she meant herself or him. Maybe both. A sound echoed through the tunnel then, a low, guttural hum, vibrating against the stone. Not footsteps. Not voices. Something else. Elias barely had time to register it before the queen moved. One moment she was beside him. The next she had thrown him aside, her hand shoving him against the tunnel wall just as something seared through the space he had been running. A lance of blue energy struck the ground where he had stood, scorching the stone, sending cracks racing outward. Elias's breath caught. Figures emerged from the darkness beyond the flickering torchlight. Not Vascari. Not entirely. They were tall, their forms wrapped in segmented armor that pulsed faintly with veins of energy, like the swords in the queen's chest. Their eyes glowed the same eerie blue, their faces obscured behind smooth, reflective visors. Elias had seen soldiers before. These were not soldiers. The queen's body tensed beside him, her gaze locked onto the figures, her fingers curling as if itching for a blade she did not yet have. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. "Sentinels." Elias swallowed. "That's a bad thing, isn't it?" She didn't answer him with words. Instead she reached forward, grasped the second sword buried in her ribs, and ripped it free. The moment the blade left her body, the air shattered. A force slammed outward from her, rippling like the aftershock of something breaking. The torches lining the tunnel flickered and died, the darkness swallowing them whole. But Elias didn't need light to feel what had just happened. Something woke up. The sentinels reacted instantly. The nearest one surged forward, its body blurring unnaturally fast. But the queen was faster. She met the attack with a fluid grace that should not have been possible after centuries entombed. The newly freed sword, now alive with pulsing light, sang as it clashed against the sentinel's arm, sending sparks flying. The impact sent the thing staggering back. But the others did not hesitate. More energy lances cut through the darkness, sizzling through the air, and Elias barely had time to move. He ducked low, instinct overriding thought, rolling to the side just as a blast melted the stone behind him. His pulse thundered in his skull. He needed to get out. No. The queen moved through the chaos like a force of nature, her sword carving arcs of glowing light through the gloom. She was precise, not wasting a single motion, her body working in perfect tandem with the weapon, as if it had always belonged to her hand. Elias wasn't so lucky. One of the sentinels turned on him, its helmeted gaze locking onto his form. It saw him, recognized him, and then it moved. Too fast. Elias barely had time to react before it was on him, an armored hand grasping for his throat. He tried to move, to twist away, but the sword in his grip burned. Not in pain. In hunger. Something inside him understood. He didn't know how. He didn't know why. But as the sentinel lunged, Elias raised the sword. And the blade answered. Light erupted from the metal, pulsing outward in a single devastating arc. It met the sentinel's strike head-on, and won. The force of the impact sent the thing reeling, its armor splitting where the sword had cut. It let out a distorted, mechanical sound, not pain but something close. Elias didn't stop to think. He ran. The queen was already moving toward the far end of the tunnel. Carter. He didn't need more prompting. He sprinted after her, the sentinels already recovering behind them. He could hear them adjusting, recalibrating. The next time they attacked, they wouldn't be caught off guard. The tunnel opened ahead, a ledge. A drop. Below, an expanse of ruins sprawled beneath an alien sky, bathed in eerie twilight. The queen did not slow. She reached the ledge and jumped. Elias skidded to a stop, staring down at the impossible drop. You have got to be Carter. Her voice snapped across the distance, sharp and commanding. The sentinels were right behind him. Elias clenched his jaw. Then he jumped. The fall should have killed him. Wind roared past Elias's ears as he plummeted, the ruins below rushing up with terrifying speed. His instincts screamed, every muscle in his body tensing for an impact he knew he wouldn't survive. But then she caught him. The queen moved like something untethered by gravity, her form twisting midair as she reached for him. One hand grasped his arm, the other angled the glowing sword downward, and then impossibly she turned the fall into a landing. The blade struck the ground first, energy surging from its edge in a controlled burst. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through the earth, slowing their descent just enough for them to land in a crouch instead of shattering against the stone. Elias gasped, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. His heart pounded, his pulse a chaotic drumbeat in his skull. The queen released him immediately, already scanning their surroundings. "Move," she ordered, her voice etched with urgency. Elias didn't argue. The ruins stretched before them, vast, crumbling remnants of a city lost to time. Enormous stone pillars jutted from the cracked earth, half-buried statues stood as silent watchers, and beneath his feet, the worn cobblestone streets pulsed faintly with veins of light. Not dead. Not abandoned. Something here still lived. Behind them the sentinels did not hesitate. The first leapt from the ledge, landing with unnatural grace, blue energy crackling across its form. The others followed, a synchronized, silent force, their glowing visors locking onto Elias and the queen. They advanced. The queen exhaled slowly, lifting the second sword, the one she had torn from her own chest. Light flickered along its edges, pulsing in rhythm with something unseen. "You were not meant to wake," one of the sentinels intoned, its voice reverberating from within its armor. "Neither fully synthetic nor fully organic, something in between." The queen tilted her head, considering them. "And yet," she said, voice steady, unafraid, "here I stand." The sentinels lunged. Elias had no time to think. Instinct took over. His grip tightened around his own sword, and as the first sentinel struck, he moved. Steel met energy. The impact sent a sharp vibration up his arm, nearly tearing the weapon from his grasp, but he held firm. The force of the clash sent him skidding backward, boots scraping against stone, but he refused to fall. The queen was beside him in an instant, a whirlwind of motion. Her blade found its mark, slicing through armor, cleaving through the sentinel's side in a burst of blue light. The thing staggered but did not fall. They weren't just strong. They were relentless. Another sentinel closed in. Too fast, too close. Elias barely saw the strike before it came, but something inside him reacted. The sword pulled him forward. Not physically. Not consciously. Something else. His body followed the motion before his mind caught up, pivoting just enough for the enemy's blade to miss his throat by inches. His own sword lashed out in response, slicing against the sentinel's arm, leaving behind a glowing, jagged wound. He shouldn't have been able to do that. But he had. The sentinel recoiled. It hesitated. And in that hesitation the queen struck. Her blade pierced its core. For the first time one of the sentinels fell. The remaining ones did not falter. They adjusted, recalibrated, closing in with mechanical precision. But something had shifted in the air between them. Elias could feel it. The queen could feel it. And so too could the sentinels. "The swords recognize you," one of them said, its voice carrying something dangerously close to understanding. The queen's expression did not change. But she shifted her stance slightly, her grip adjusting on the weapon, as though testing the weight of something she had always known. "Their mistake," she said simply. Elias wasn't sure who she meant. The sentinels. The ones who had entombed her. The ones who had tried to bury whatever she was beneath layers of stone, steel and time. Another pulse rippled through the ruins. The sentinels froze. Elias's breath hitched. The air tightened, an invisible force pressing against his ribs, something vast and immeasurable stirring beneath their feet. The cobblestones pulsed brighter. The ruins answered. Not dead. Not abandoned. Elias felt it, a presence unfurling beneath the surface, something immense waking in response to them. The sentinels turned sharply, not toward Elias nor the queen but toward the ruins themselves. "The seal is breaking," one of them said, the first trace of something that might have been concern entering its voice. The queen lifted her chin slightly, watching them. "You never understood, did you?" The sentinels did not answer. But their hesitation spoke for them. And in that hesitation the earth beneath them cracked. The ruins shuddered, deep and absolute, as if the city itself was breathing again. Elias stumbled, barely catching himself against a nearby pillar. His heartbeat thundered against his ribs. Something is coming. The sentinels knew it too. Without another word they turned. And they ran. Not retreating. Not regrouping. They were fleeing. Elias turned to the queen, pulse hammering. What the hell is happening? She exhaled slowly, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. Then finally she looked at him. The third sword, she said. Elias stilled. His gaze flicked down toward her chest. Toward the last remaining blade. The one still buried within her, pulsing faintly, waiting. The third sword. The final seal. And the thing it was holding back. The ground beneath them was no longer stable. The ancient stones of the ruined city shifted, vibrating as if something enormous stirred beneath their feet. Dust and loose rubble cascaded from towering structures, cracks spreading through the foundations like veins of awakening power. Elias swallowed hard, gripping his sword tighter. The sentinels had fled, and that alone told him all he needed to know. Whatever they had been guarding was worse than them. The queen remained still. Her expression was unreadable, eyes fixed on the glowing lines of energy racing through the cracks in the earth. The final sword in her chest pulsed faintly, its rhythm synchronized with the tremors beneath them. Elias followed her gaze, unease settling in his stomach. You're not going to pull that last one out, are you? She didn't answer. Instead she exhaled, slow and deliberate, and placed a hand over the hilt. Elias took a sharp step forward. Hold on. We don't know what happens if... She drew the blade. The instant the sword left her body, the world fractured. A soundless wave of force rushed outward, bending reality itself. Elias staggered back, hands flying to his ears even though there was no sound. The light in the cracks blazed, surging toward the sky in violent arcs of energy. The ruins trembled, not with collapse but with something rising. And then the earth split open. Elias barely kept his footing as the city beneath them gave way. The stone fractured into jagged platforms, descending like broken puzzle pieces into the depths below. A shape emerged from the darkness beneath the ruins. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't even something Elias could describe. It was vast. Too vast. It wasn't just in front of him. It was behind him, beside him, above him, existing in ways that defied his understanding. Its form twisted and uncoiled like a mass of shadows, shifting between presence and absence. But what shook him most was that it had no eyes. No mouth. No discernible features. And yet when it turned toward him he felt it see him. The weight of its attention was suffocating, pressing against his ribs, filling the air with an indescribable gravity. The queen stood motionless before it, the third sword glowing faintly in her grip. She lifted the blade slightly, not in challenge but in recognition. Elias could barely breathe. What? His voice caught. He had been about to ask what is it? But something inside him already knew. Not a creature. Not a being. A guardian. A force that had been bound here for longer than time itself could measure. The sentinels had not been protecting the ruins. They had been protecting the seal. And now that the final sword was free, so was it. The entity shifted, its presence warping the very air around it. The pressure in Elias's skull mounted, images, thoughts, memories not his own flooding his mind. He saw glimpses of the past, a history long erased, a war fought before the concept of war had even been named. A war against them. Not the sentinels. Something far worse. Something coming. Elias's breath hitched. He turned to the queen, desperation rising in his chest. Tell me you knew about this. For the first time she hesitated. The entity moved. It did not attack. It did not speak. It lowered itself toward her, the space around it bending, shifting. And then it bowed. Elias's pulse stopped. The realization settled in his bones like ice. This thing. This ancient, unfathomable being. It wasn't the enemy. It had been waiting. Waiting for her. The queen exhaled, closing her eyes for the briefest moment. When she opened them again, something in her gaze had changed. Not just knowledge. Understanding. She had not just been buried with the swords. He had been the lock. And now she was the key. Elias took a slow step forward, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. What happens now? The queen lifted the final sword, its edge glowing with an eerie, pulsing light. She turned her gaze to the horizon where the sky was darkening, not with clouds but with movement. Not all prisons had walls. Some had sentinels. And some, Elias realized, had been built not to keep something in, but to keep something out. The sky split open. Not like a storm, not like anything natural. It was a wound, a jagged fracture in the fabric of reality itself. From that abyssal rift, something pushed through. Elias felt it before he saw it. A pressure against his chest, his skull, his very thoughts. It was like drowning in an ocean that wasn't there, the weight of something immense pressing against his mind. The queen stood still, the final sword glowing in her grip, its light pulsing in defiance of the darkness gathering above. The entity before her, the thing that had bowed, remained silent, unmoving. It was not afraid, but it was waiting. The breach widened. Shapes moved within. Not creatures. Not ships. Something worse. Elias didn't have a name for them, but his body recognized them. His instincts screamed at him in ways his conscious mind couldn't process. These were not invaders, not soldiers, not even conquerors. They were eradicators. They were not here to take. They were here to unmake. The queen finally spoke, her voice steady despite the enormity of what loomed above. They return. Elias turned to her, his throat dry. What the hell are they? She did not answer at first. Instead, she lifted the sword higher, and the entity beside her moved. Its shifting form coiled and stretched, its very presence distorting the ruins around it. The air hummed with an energy Elias couldn't name, a silent exchange happening between the queen and the thing that had been sealed for untold millennia. Only then did she answer. The ones who built the first graves. A chill crawled down Elias's spine. Graves. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not just knowledge. Memory. They were not always destroyers, she said softly. Once they were creators. Above them, the first of the horrors began to emerge from the breach. They did not descend. They did not land. They simply spread, unraveling through the air like smoke made of hunger. Too many limbs. Too many mouths. And yet no eyes. Nothing to see with because they didn't need to. They could feel them. Elias gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on his sword. And now? The queen's expression darkened. Now they seek to erase all that remains of what they built. The first of the things descended. Elias barely had time to react before it was on him. It did not move like something that belonged in this universe. It bent and twisted wrongly as if the laws of motion meant nothing to it. Clawed appendages lashed out, not with force but with something worse. Elias felt himself unraveling. His arms, his legs, his very sense of self, slipping. It wasn't an attack. It was consumption. And then light. The queen's sword slashed through the air, and the thing reeled back with a shriek that made no sound. The energy from the blade seared through it, and for the first time, Elias saw something he hadn't thought possible. The thing bled. Not blood. Not anything physical. But it bled. It recoiled, twisting away, its form struggling to reassemble. The queen did not hesitate. She lunged, driving the blade deeper, and the thing let out a final shuddering convulsion before it collapsed inward, its body folding into itself until nothing remained. Elias gasped, stumbling backward, his entire body buzzing from the encounter. He looked at the queen, at the glowing sword in her grip. They can be killed, he breathed. She did not look away from the breach above, where more of them were pouring through. Yes. Elias forced himself to stand straighter, to push aside the fear curling in his gut. Then we fight. The queen turned to him, her gaze steady. We fight, she agreed. The entity beside her, the one that had been sealed, the one that had waited, began to move. And this time it did not bow. It rose. A shape without form, a force without limit, its very presence igniting the air around it. The ruins pulsed brighter, as if the city itself was waking alongside it. And then it lashed out. Not with weapons. Not with physical force. But with purpose. The horrors above shrieked, recoiling from its presence. For the first time they hesitated. They recognized it. They feared it. And that was when Elias knew. The sentinels had not been guarding the queen. They had not even been guarding the prison. They had been guarding this. A weapon. A being. A force designed not to contain the horrors, but to destroy them. Elias looked to the queen. She stood tall, unyielding, the final sword in her grip glowing brighter than ever. He knew without her saying it that this was not the end. This was the beginning. The first strike came like a tear through the fabric of existence. The entity, the ancient guardian that had bowed to the queen, unfurled, stretching its form toward the horrors pouring from the breach. Where it touched, the air itself shattered, reality bending in violent, unnatural ripples. The invading creatures recoiled, their shifting, writhing masses shrinking as if instinctively withdrawing from something older, something stronger. Elias barely had time to process it before the queen was moving. She stepped forward with the grace of someone who had done this before, perhaps countless times before in lives long buried beneath the dust of forgotten wars. The final sword in her grip pulsed with power, reacting to the presence of the enemy, or perhaps to something deeper, something woven into the fabric of existence itself. The horrors descended. They did not fall like creatures of flesh and gravity. They unraveled, folding toward the ground in spirals of motion that defied comprehension. Their limbs, their mouths, things that should not exist, shifted, stretched, reached. Elias had seen monsters before. He had fought beasts, men, machines, things born of war and hunger and rage. But this was different. These things weren't just living. They were undoing. Where they moved, the world faltered. The ruins around them began to degrade, not in a normal, gradual collapse, but in an absence, as though time itself had been pulled from the stone. Walls faded into dust without crumbling. The sky warped, light distorting in ways it shouldn't. And still the queen stood her ground. She moved, and the sword in her hand answered. The first swing carved light into the darkness. Where the blade passed, the air tore. The nearest creature let out a silent, gaping scream, its form splitting apart not into flesh or shadow but into nothing. It writhed, limbs clawing at the space around it, and then it was gone. Not dead. Erased. Elias barely had time to think before another lunged at him. Came too fast. Too alien. Too wrong. He barely got his sword up in time, the steel colliding with something that wasn't solid, wasn't air, wasn't anything he could name. His arms buckled from the impact, pain shooting through his muscles as his blade stopped the thing from reaching him. For a heartbeat they locked together, human steel against something that should never have existed. Then the queen was there. Her sword flashed again, cutting through the creature with the same terrifying finality. The moment the blade touched it, its form fractured, light spilling through its seams like a broken vessel. Elias felt it. A pull, a great unraveling, a thing being removed from the very concept of being. It vanished. Elias staggered back, his breath coming fast. His hands trembled around his sword. "I can't," he swallowed. "My weapon doesn't work on them." The queen turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "No," she said simply. "It doesn't." He clenched his teeth. "Then what the hell am I supposed to do?" She lifted the final sword, holding it between them. Its glow pulsed, not just light but something deeper, something alive. "They were bound to me," she said softly. "So they answered to me alone." Elias stared at her, his chest heaving. He knew what she was implying. He knew. The final sword was the key. And he couldn't wield it. Only she could. Another shriek split the air, soundless but deafening in the mind. More of the horrors had descended, their forms swarming around them, countless in number. The guardian entity surged forward to meet them, its form a twisting mass of power and motion, tearing through the creatures in ways Elias could barely comprehend. But there were too many. Even as it struck them down, more came. Elias turned back to the queen, chest tight. "You need to use it. Now." She was silent for a long moment. Then she raised the sword. And the world answered. The ruins beneath them shook, not with collapse but with awakening. The stone pulsed, ancient symbols blazing to life, the same light that had been trapped within the queen now spreading outward, igniting the battlefield. The horrors hesitated. For the first time they stopped advancing. The queen's voice was quiet, but it carried. This world was never theirs to take. She drove the sword into the ground. A pulse erupted outward, rippling through the air like a tidal wave of reality itself. The horrors screamed. Their forms faltered, buckling beneath the force. One by one they began to unravel, not through violence, not through death, but through a force far more terrifying. They were being erased. Elias felt it. The weight, the presence, the wrongness, all of it peeling away. The queen did not falter. He pressed the blade deeper, the pulse of energy growing, spreading, cleansing. The horrors tried to resist. They twisted, they lashed out, they shrieked. But it was too late. They had been unmade. And then, silence. Elias gasped, his knees nearly buckling as the weight in the air lifted. His head pounded, his vision swam, his limbs felt like they had turned to lead. But the breach was gone. The sky was whole once more. The ruins, though still broken, were unchanged. The decay had stopped. The queen remained where she was, her hand still gripping the sword embedded in the earth. Her expression was unreadable, her breath slow, steady. Elias forced himself to step forward. Did we? He hesitated. Did we stop them? She did not look at him. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the sky, on the place where the breach had been. No, she said softly. This was only the first. The air was heavy with the aftermath. The breach had closed, but the feeling of something wrong still lingered. Elias stood beside the queen, his breath still ragged from the intensity of the battle. His limbs ached, his heart pounding, yet he couldn't shake the image of the horrors, their forms unraveling under the queen's command, their very existence erased from reality. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The ruins around them were still, silent, though Elias could feel the pulse of energy that had just been released still echoing in his bones. The remnants of the battle, the scattered remains of the creatures, now nothing more than faint ripples in the air, were already starting to fade. But in the silence he realized there was more. Something the queen had said, something that hadn't quite settled in his mind yet. This was only the first. He glanced at her, her form silhouetted against the sky. She hadn't moved, hadn't wavered, her gaze still locked on the place where the rift had been. The faintest trace of something like sorrow clung to her expression, though it was hard to tell. She was a queen, a force of nature, but there was something else in her, something he couldn't quite grasp. The first. Elias repeated, his voice rough. What do you mean by that? Those things, they were impossible. And yet you wiped them out. Her eyes flickered toward him then, but her gaze was distant, as though her mind was somewhere far beyond the ruins they stood in. The breach was a signal, she said quietly. A sign that they have returned. Elias frowned. Returned? Who? The ones who seek to unmake everything. To destroy not just this world but all worlds. Her words were calm, but they held the weight of something ancient, something beyond human understanding. They have come once before, long before your time. And now they are coming again. Elias's stomach turned. He had fought many enemies in his life, but nothing had ever felt like this. The sensation of the ground shifting beneath his feet, the weight of forces beyond his comprehension, all of it pressed in on him, making the air feel thick, suffocating. You're telling me that this breach was just a warning? His voice trembled slightly and he hated how it sounded. He was a soldier. A man who had faced down impossible odds, fought enemies on the brink of extinction and survived. And yet here he was, standing in the remnants of a battle he barely understood, facing an enemy that didn't just kill but unmade. The queen nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. The first breach is always the same. They test the defenses. They gauge the strength of the worlds they seek to erase. She paused, her lips tight. The next time they will not stop. They will come in full force. Elias swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. And we stop them how? She didn't answer immediately, but the question hung in the air between them like a palpable force. He waited, trying to reconcile everything he had seen, everything he had fought. The monsters, the otherworldly destruction, the feeling of reality itself crumbling. How could they even hope to fight something that defied all logic? Finally, the queen turned toward him. There was no softness in her expression, no comfort. Just the cold, hard truth. We don't stop them. Not with weapons, not with armies. We only delay them. Her voice was firm, unwavering. The sword, the one you saw me wield, is a key, but even it is not enough to close the breach permanently. Elias felt his chest tighten. So we're just buying time? Exactly, she said. Time and perhaps something more. Elias's brow furrowed. What else could we possibly have? Her gaze met his. The final sword. The one that lies beyond the reach of this world. The one that has been hidden for millennia. Elias blinked. A third sword? The queen nodded. A weapon not forged by man or alien but by something much older. Something much more powerful. Its purpose is to seal the breach, for good. And you know where it is? Her lips tightened. I know where it was. But it is lost to us now. Elias stared at her. What do you mean, lost? Can't we just... No, she cut him off, her voice sharp. The The sword cannot be found by just any means. It is hidden in a place beyond this world, a place where time and space do not follow the same rules. Elias's mind reeled. The weight of everything she had just said pressed down on him. A sword that could close the breach for good. And yet it was lost. And they had no idea where it was. You want me to go after it? His voice was steady, but beneath it there was a flicker of doubt. He didn't hesitate. Yes. The Queen's gaze softened, but only slightly. You are the only one who can reach it. Elias shook his head. Why me? I'm not special. I'm just a soldier. A man who stumbled into a war he never asked for. You are more than that, she said softly. You are the key that connects this world to the next. The sword may be lost, but the path to it is within you. Elias stared at her, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He was the key. How was that even possible? He was just a man. But there was something in her eyes, a certainty, a belief, that made him think for the first time that maybe he wasn't the only one who didn't fully understand what was happening. The world had changed in ways that could not be undone. And now he had a choice. The Queen nodded toward the distance. There is no time to waste. The breach will open again. And when it does, we must be ready. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. Where do we start? And with that, the path before him was clear. Elias had never felt time move so quickly. It wasn't the kind of urgency that drove a man into a battle. It was something more subtle, more pervasive, like the rising tide of a storm that had already started to consume everything in its path. They had a lead. The Queen had shared what little she knew about the location of the third sword, a place where the boundaries of time and space blurred, where even the stars themselves seemed to dissolve into a haze of impossible geometry. And now, Elias found himself walking beside her, the weight of their mission heavy between them. Their steps echoed through the corridor of the ruined city, the walls of stone whispering of a history long forgotten. They had left the battlefield behind, the remnants of the breach and the horrors that had come through already beginning to fade from the world's memory. But not from Elias's mind. He still saw their twisted shapes, the way they had unraveled, their screams swallowed by the void. He could still feel the pull of the Queen's power, the way the air had vibrated with an energy far older than anything he had ever known. Do you truly believe this sword will stop them? He asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, uncertain, as if testing the weight of the words before they escaped his lips. The Queen didn't look at him, her gaze fixed ahead. I do, she said simply. If we can reach it. Elias didn't say anything more. There were no guarantees in this. He had fought wars before, but this felt different. This felt like a battle against reality itself. And in that, there was something almost comforting in her certainty. She had lived through the ages. She had seen the collapse and the rebirth of worlds. If she believed they could still win, maybe there was a chance. They came to a stop before an ancient door, no more than a slab of stone weathered by time but still standing. The air around it pulsed, a faint hum like the heartbeat of the earth. Elias could feel the difference in the air as soon as he stepped near it. The oppressive weight that had settled in the back of his mind since the Queen had first spoken of the sword shifted. It was like the door itself was a threshold, a boundary between what was and what could never be again. The Queen reached for the door, placing her hand upon the stone. The hum grew louder, then softer, like a sigh passing through the very bones of the world. For a moment, Elias couldn't move, transfixed by the sight of her standing there, calm and unwavering as the stone murmured to her. Then with a creak the door opened. Elias blinked, his thoughts scrambled. It wasn't the way doors normally opened. No hinges, no grinding metal. The stone simply parted as though it had never been solid at all. Behind it, a vast chamber stretched out into the darkness, the floor of smooth stone disappearing into a chasm of unearthly shadow. The walls seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. What is this place? He asked, stepping forward. The Queen didn't answer immediately. She simply walked in, her footsteps light against the strange, undulating surface. Elias followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The further they walked, the more the space around them seemed to bend, until the chamber itself felt like a dream, a place that shouldn't exist but did anyway. This is the place where time does not follow, she said at last, her voice low, almost reverent. The boundaries between worlds thin here. The sword we seek was hidden beyond them, waiting for the one who could cross. Elias felt the words crawl through him, but they didn't make sense. Hidden? he asked, his voice rising with confusion. If it's hidden, how can we find it? The queen stopped and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. By understanding that there is no finding it. There is only reaching. Elias frowned. He didn't understand, but there was no time to question her now. They had come this far, and despite the dread clawing at his chest, he trusted her. He had no choice but to. Ahead, the chamber widened, revealing a circle of light in the center of the room. It seemed to pull at him, drawing him forward, and as they approached, Elias saw what lay within it. It wasn't a sword, not like he had expected. No gleaming blade, no weapon forged for war. What lay in the center of the circle was something much more subtle. A stone, smooth and dark, its surface shimmering with an inner light. It was as though the stone was alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. The queen stepped forward, reaching for the stone, her fingers brushing its surface. For a moment nothing happened. The stone remained still, undisturbed, as though it had never been touched. Then, with a shock that rattled through Elias's bones, the stone shifted. The air around them seemed to warp as the circle of light flared, and the stone split open, revealing the hilt of a sword, its form elusive, flickering between shapes as if it existed in several places at once. Elias stepped back, his breath caught in his throat. The sword was unreal. Not just otherworldly, it was something beyond even that. The fabric of existence itself seemed to quiver in its presence. He could feel it. This was not just a weapon. This was the key. The queen's hand hovered above it, but she didn't take it. Instead she turned to Elias. "It is not meant for me," she said softly. "It calls to you." Elias swallowed, uncertainty and fear twisting in his gut. "What do you mean?" "Take it," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "It was always meant for you." Elias hesitated. He didn't understand. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even a hero. Yet as he stared at the sword, a strange sense of certainty bloomed in his chest. It was like the world had already chosen and he had no choice but to follow. With a deep breath, he reached forward and wrapped his fingers around the hilt. The moment he did, the entire chamber seemed to shudder. Time itself seemed to stop as the sword solidified, its true form emerging. The sword was no longer a flickering light. It was a weapon of pure power, its blade gleaming with an energy that didn't belong to any known world. Elias's heart raced, but when he gripped it, he knew. This was the weapon that would either save everything, or unravel it all. The moment Elias gripped the sword, the world seemed to bend around him. The light of the chamber flickered, and the air crackled with an energy that wasn't just foreign. It was alien, like the fabric of reality itself was being stretched thin. The sword hummed, its power thrumming through his hand as if it had been waiting for him, and in that instant, Elias understood something profound. This was no ordinary weapon. It was not just an instrument of war. It was the final hope, the last defense against an ancient enemy. And somehow it had been waiting for him all along. He stepped back, still gripping the hilt, the weight of it both heavy and impossibly light at the same time. The queen stood before him, her eyes narrowed with what looked like a mix of respect and something else. Something deeper, almost like concern. "It's done then," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You have it." Elias nodded, but his mind raced. "What now?" he asked, the words feeling more like an echo than a real question. "We must prepare," she replied. "The breach won't remain closed for long, and there is still one more part of the puzzle you need to understand." Elias frowned. The sword had already revealed so much. Its power, its connection to the very fabric of the world itself. But there was something in the queen's words that unsettled him, something he couldn't yet grasp. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I've got the sword. Isn't that enough?" She shook her head slowly. "It's never that simple." The queen began to walk around him, her movements measured, almost deliberate. Her eyes never left him, as if she were studying him, waiting for him to see what she saw. "There is more to this weapon than its power," she said, her voice low. "More than you can yet understand. It isn't just a sword. It's the anchor, Elias. The thing that keeps everything from unraveling. But to wield it, you must first understand the truth about the breach and what lies beyond it." Elias was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The truth about the breach. The truth about what they were truly up against. He had thought he knew the stakes, but this was different. The queen wasn't just telling him what they were fighting. She was telling him how the very fabric of their existence was at risk. I don't understand, he said finally, the frustration clear in his voice. What does that mean exactly? She stopped, facing him now. The breach is not just a rift in space. It is a tear in the order of the universe itself. The creatures that came through, those things, are just the beginning. They are the harbingers. The real threat lies beyond. Elias's mind reeled. Beyond? You mean, there's something worse than those creatures? The Queen nodded. Much worse. The true enemy. The one that created the breach to begin with. The one that seeks to unmake all things. Elias shook his head. Unmake everything? He repeated the words, trying to make sense of them. You mean like, erasing us from existence? Not just us, she said, her voice almost grim. All worlds. All realities. Time, space, everything. They seek to return the universe to nothingness. And the sword you hold is the only thing that can stop them. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The enormity of it was overwhelming. He had fought battles, had faced death countless times, but nothing had prepared him for this. He was holding a weapon capable of stopping the very force that threatened the entire universe. But even as the weight of responsibility settled over him, something else flickered in his mind. The uncertainty. The doubt. The nagging fear that despite the Queen's certainty, despite the power of the sword, there might be no stopping what was coming. He glanced down at the sword again. It was no longer a flickering light, no longer a weapon he could barely comprehend. It had solidified, the blade gleaming with an almost ethereal energy. But it was still somehow just a sword. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. So how do we stop this thing? The one behind the breach. The Queen met his gaze, her eyes filled with an unspoken sadness. We don't stop it, Elias. We can only hold it back. We can only delay the inevitable. That's the truth of the sword. Conceal the breach for a time, but the forces behind it are ancient, powerful. They will find a way to break through again. Then why even try? He asked, his voice sharp with frustration. If we're just buying time, why fight at all? The Queen's expression softened just for a moment. Because there is always hope, Elias. Even in the darkest times there is always a chance. Elias swallowed, trying to find something in her words that made sense. Hope. It was a foreign concept to him, a soldier who had seen too much death to believe in anything so fragile. But the Queen believed in it. Hope, he repeated, tasting the word on his tongue. She nodded. Yes. Hope. It is why we fight. Why we cannot give in no matter how impossible it seems. A long silence stretched between them, both of them standing in the chamber, the sword humming faintly in Elias's hand. Finally he nodded, though he didn't quite know if he believed her words. So we delay the breach. And hope it's enough. The Queen's lips twitched, just the smallest of smiles. That's all we can do, Elias. That and fight until our last breath. Elias looked down at the sword again, feeling the weight of his decision pressing against him. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't even just about winning. It was about something bigger. Something infinite. And it terrified him. But he had no choice but to take the sword and step into the unknown. He was their last hope. The universe's last hope. And whatever came next, he would face it. But first they had to find a way to stop the breach. And time was running out.